Hi, this is Steve Dubb here, senior editor with Nonprofit Quarterly. And I'm here with Gar Alperovitz, founding principal of the Democracy Collaborative and author of two books on Hiroshima, Atomic Diplomacy, Hiroshima and Potsdam, which was published in 1965, and The Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb, which was published in 1995. Gar, welcome to Nonprofit Quarterly.
Oh, great to be with you, Steve.
You were 9, I believe, at the time of the Hiroshima bombing. Do you have any memories of it?
I don't remember the bombing itself, but I do remember the wonderful enthusiasm at the end of World War II. The people in the streets, very excited, very happy. I remember I had paper airplanes or paper mache, which were I burned in the street. The war was over. There was great joy, but I don't recall at that point the atomic bombs.
Thanks. When did you get a sense that the standard U.S. account about the dropping of the bomb, that the bomb was necessary for that celebration, was flawed?
Probably when I read the diaries of Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, which were made available in the early 1960s. He was a Republican conservative Secretary of War who had been brought into the cabinet by Roosevelt and was in Truman's cabinet. And a very serious guy who kept very, very thoughtful notes in his diary. And it became clear he kept using the term that the atomic bomb, this is in the spring of 1945, 3, 4, 5 months before the atomic bomb was used, August 6th and August 9th. He kept talking about it as the, quote, MasterCard of diplomacy towards the Russians, both in Europe and in Asia. And I was actually doing a PhD thesis, not on atomic weapons, but on how the US policymakers during the end of World War II and the early post-war period thought about reconstructing the global economy. And I ran into this information on the tactical thoughts about how the atomic bomb would give them a real leverage, primarily against the Russians, to help them implement the plan. And I should be careful about that. These are people who had lived through 2 world wars, and they thought that, and a Great Depression. So they were trying to organize, and they'd seen Hitler and the Japanese attacks. They were trying to organize the world in a way to prevent another war and another Hitler and another. So that's their motivation. I had a professor who used to talk about the tragedy of American diplomacy.
What would you say was the most surprising finding of your research as you went through, the Stimson papers and all the other research you did for those books?
Well, the thing that I guess the thing that always stuck on my mind is the following. They used the 2 atomic bombs. The Red Army did the atomic bomb on August 6th. The Red Army attacked this midnight on August 8th, as promised, exactly 3 months after the end of the German War. And the Japanese cabinet, we know, was not at all overwhelmed by the atomic bomb because their cities had been blown away 1, 2, 3 right after. But they knew that they couldn't fight the Russians in a 2-front war. So, and then August 9th was Nagasaki. And after that, the surrender was very quick. The most surprising thing for me, and the one that lingered in my mind, still does, after Radio Tokyo had surrendered publicly, broadcast its surrender, acceptance of the Potsdam Proclamation, which was a surrender document, but before the actual cables, formal diplomatic cables had gotten to Washington, the US government authorized the largest conventional bombing raid in world history. 1,400 bombers just went over and bombed the smithereens. And it was somehow that lingering brutality is the thing that always stuck in my mind, and still does, that people were so caught up in the war and so caught up in the anger and so caught up in we're going to show them that a lot more people, mostly civilians, because the young guys were away from Japan, not entirely, obviously, away from the cities. Those are the people who are getting killed.
One time, it was commonly believed in the United States that nuclear war was the thing that was going to lead to the destruction of humankind. Now, other threats like the climate emergency get more attention. But, as we've seen with COVID, sometimes the threats you don't think about hit you. So, how should we be fearing the bomb today, and what should we be thinking about it?
Well, there's two aspects that are, I think, very important. We've been very lucky. There are, 7,000 bombs around the world now, and none of them have gone off in anger. I would be very surprised if we're going to be that lucky going forward, that somebody is going to use one of these and somebody else is going to use another one back. So I think that's it's a mistake to be complacent about nuclear weapons.
Clearly, in the U.S., the myth of innocence has been an important one, maintained in face of all the evidence in terms of the dropping of the atomic bomb, for example. Right now, the country is going through a racial reckoning. Is there a reckoning that we also need to go through regarding Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and what would that look like?
I really think it is, because the quiet on nuclear weapons is thundering. These things, we've been extremely lucky. They haven't gone off for 75 years in anger. And I think it's time for the climate movement, but also for a new anti-nuclear movement to begin raising these issues again. Hiroshima, for me, I've written 2 books about this subject in general and also quite specific. Hiroshima, for me, is much more about the future than the past. That it's a lesson about the dangers of these weapons and how irresponsible decision-making can be. President Truman was extremely naive and uninformed when he came into office. Roosevelt had not informed him. The man who really controlled this was something like Vice President Cheney, who kind of in the early years of the Bush administration knew so much about government that he dominated President Bush for a long period until finally Bush got a little tired of it. That's the same story in the case of Truman. The Secretary of State, James Burns, was a figure like Cheney. And his view was the bomb would make the Russians more manageable, and they understood that. So they started building their own bombs, and off we go to the world arms race rather than an attempt, as many of the scientists were saying, to try to cut this off before it got rolling because of the huge dangers are involved for some kind of arms control and disarmament effort.
Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think there are 2 things to say. There's new studies, again and again, but there's a much more recent study of the violation of international law, of bombing essentially non-military targets. The bombing was aimed at Hiroshima was not a military target. There was a small base there, but the goal was to hit an industrial center surrounded by workers' houses. The targeting was explicit. So it's a clear violation of law. And we ought to begin to rebuild that framework. But I also think if you look at Black Lives Matter movement and the feminist movement and the climate change movement, those are the kinds of things that happen in a good society. It's time again, and I think that's possible, that we begin to rebuild the movement to control these weapons. And so I think talking about what happened at Hiroshima is not about simply about the historical debate about what the documents now show, and we now have many, many documents. It's really about how dangerous the decision-making can be. And then that comes down to citizen action. Are we going to somehow build a support for a new regime of controlling these weapons and bring that back into the center of the debate as climate change was moved to the center of the debate? That's a responsibility of the citizenry.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Steve. Good to be with you.